slave ships. Like, wow. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about this subject and really get into it.
Okay.
So let's talk about slave ships. And what's the first thing that you can tell me when we think of the subject of slave ships?
Well, the first thing that I think about is that they were really just ships, not specifically slave ships, because what they was cargo ships that got converted into slave ships.
What can you tell me about these cargo ships? Let's just start off with the basics. Ships existed. We have records of them everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Slave ships the ships weren't built to carry slaves. Or for the most part, they were converted to carry slaves.
Yes, okay. And now there were over 100 different kinds of ships, or sailing vessels, the things that you travel on the water with. There was over 100 of them.
Kinds
yes,
built, during colonial times.
And yes, and what I found out is because I wanted to find out what kinds of ships were being used to transport the slaves.
Okay.
So I did go to slavevoyages.org, which is a website that is dedicated to the transatlantic slave trade. What they have is about what they say is about 3/4 of the ships that docked in the Americas. They have about 3/4 of them documented. And so if you go there, you can find out where they documented their information from, which is from several sources. And so I use it as a trustworthy website to go to.
Okay.
So when I went there, and as I was researching these ships, I found out that there were really 5 particular kinds of ships that I kept running into over and over and over and over again.
Okay. And so what kind of ships were there? What are their names?
Sloops, schooners, brigs or brigadiers, snows, and ships of the line, or what they just called them, just ships.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so these ships here, and not just these ships, but other ships. The question is, okay, well, where were these ships being built? It's a valuable question because, we talk about land, we're talking about resources as far as the timber is concerned, and a lot of other things that you need in order to build hundreds and thousands of ships, So where were these ships being built during colonial times?
Okay, well, we know that ships were being built worldwide.
Right, we know that the Chinese were building ships way before anything else, along with a whole bunch of other people, but we're talking about colonial times.
Okay, well, during that time, what is interesting is that I found out that while ships were being built worldwide, that the ships that the United States started building really turned out to be, and then the United States ships turned out to be the shipbuilding ships that everyone wanted to use. And so the United States then became like the shipbuilding capital
of the world.
Yes.
So
during the 1700s.
During the 1700s, as we asked ourselves the question, a valuable question, and we explore that, the facts have come out that, America actually was the capital of the shipbuilding industry during the 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very interesting because, that's not a part of American history that's really discussed. I actually don't remember that as a part of my public education.
Well, and no, and they don't really tell these things. And really, what was going on is that as these cities, or really as people were moving into the colonies, you have to clear you have to clear the domain. You have to clear it. So they had to clear cut trees so that you can make way for housing, schools, businesses. And so as these cities started getting bigger and bigger, they were tearing down the trees, and then they were using the lumber. Of course, the lumber was being used for all sorts of things, but the ships was one of the big things because this is what was making money for the United States.
Right, as we said, it became the capital of the shipbuilding industry. And so just think about the economic empowerment that it gave the United States, or at least the colonial United States, as it was developing. It was definitely a major part of the economic development, along with, of course, the slaves that were being used to build the ships.
To build the ships, to clear the land, to transport the timber, to they were used in every every
Let's
aspect.
talk about these shipbuilding yards and where they were. Again, we're talking about 1600 to 1700.
Yes, well, where they started out were at the ports. And these ports are basically where your large cities were coming up.
Okay.
Okay, so these ports were, what turned into your major ports was Boston, Rhode Island, New York,
Okay.
and Philadelphia, which became very big ports up in the north. And these were the places where they became the shipbuilding capitals up in the north.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, in 1720, that Philadelphia, wait a minute, let me make sure, because I want to make sure, yes, in Philadelphia there were at least a dozen shipyards. And that is because there was an abundance of trees in that area, but also because of the waterways that they were able, Philadelphia in particular, was able to get trees from further away than Boston or like in New York. And so what happened is that by 1750, that Philadelphia turned into the capital of making ships.
Okay.
So they became the shipbuilding capital, Philadelphia, by 1750.
All right, and so we actually answered a few questions there. It's like, one of the questions is, so where did they get all of the trees to build all of these ships? And we could say, look at the concrete jungles of the United States. How about, honestly, a lot of the trees, specifically Philadelphia, prior to colonization, Philadelphia was a straight up forest.
Yes.
We had waterfalls in Philadelphia. We had, Philadelphia was a forest, and then in the middle of this forest, as in most places here, big chiefdoms where you had thousands of peoples cohabitating, mound complexes, and then centered around that, they were living in tune with nature. And so,
and what is interesting though is that many of these ports and these kinds of things were basically set up
next to mound complexes.
Well, how about they took over the mound complexes?
And
they were
as a
utilizing
staging
them.
ground.
Yes,
Okay.
they utilized them because they were already there.
Right.
Why are you going to not use something that is already there?
Okay,
You
right.
know.
And so to get back, so now, okay, the timber being used is coming from the United States.
Yes.
The United States becomes the major capital for shipbuilding for the world for quite a few years, at least 50 to 100 years. And so let's get into how this happened and why this happened, and specifically I want to talk about the trees and the timber itself.
Okay, well, one of the things about Philadelphia and why it became the shipbuilding capital is not only because of location, which was, again, being able to bring the things from further away, but by the middle of the 17th century, Boston and New York, they were starting to deplete those trees.
Okay.
And so they needed to start looking for an area now where they can get an abundance of trees. Now, of course, the further west you go where people haven't been living, of course, there's always going to be an abundance of trees here that they could use
I mean,
for
the
their
United
dream.
States is so vast.
Yes. But what happened is that they started looking further south, and then they started realizing that some of the trees that they were finding now in Georgia and South Carolina, that they had particular trees that were called red oak. No, not the red oak, the live oak trees, okay? And live oak was a very dense wood, and they found that this wood was a much better quality oak than just even regular oak.
Okay.
So they started using this live oak now for the boats, and now you have ships now that will be lasting even longer.
Right.
And not only were they finding this live oak down in the south, but they also found another source for pine trees, you know, and red cedar then also became popular, especially with that type of boat that was called schooners.
Okay.
A lot of merchants liked the schooners and the red cedar that was used for the schooners. They were saying because the wood was very dense, it lasted, and but it was also lightweight, so it could make a trip a little bit faster than some of the other ones.
And if I'm not mistaken from the research, that ship's here being built in the Americas because of the wood and because of the wood. Some of the ships were actually make 2, 3, 4 trips, where the European made ships would only maybe take 1 or 2 at best.
Per year.
Per year.
Per year, yes.
Because of all of the upkeep that was necessary.
Right, exactly, yes.
Right. Which leads us to another question. I was wondering if we should include this because it kind of goes off topic, but it doesn't. Because, you know, first we're talking about the slave ships and the fact that they existed, the fact that we have so much information about it also verifies all of the information we have to prove the low numbers of Africans being shipped directly into the United States. It's further verification of, you know, the statement that everybody running around with, you know, only 5% of the slave population came directly from Africa. I think I heard that a couple of times.
Okay, yes.
But beyond that, as we contemplate that idea, when we start doing the research on the ships and what was happening, and you know, we started looking, you know, we like to look at the journals, we like to look at the logs, we like to look at the
numbers,
cargo, you know, what was being carried on this trip.
How many were on the ships?
How many people were on the ship? How many were crew members versus, you know, how many were passengers?
And you know what
slaves?
is what is interesting, which we really didn't get to, but the numbers that were on the ships, most of those ships were carrying less than 100 people. The
Right.
ones that I ran into. Now, of course, there were that carried more, but you'll see like the ships that were like schooners and the sloops. They were not very large. So they didn't carry a large cargo because they had additional cargo besides slaves
Right.
that was being
because
shipped.
It's more money to be made. Just
Right. Yeah, slaves was not the only money source.
Okay. And so as we deal with that reality, you know, we were going through this and we started to see a depletion in the number of slaves being transported into you know, the colonial United States after this, you know, late 1700s, early 1800s. You know, I wanted to touch on that just a little bit so that, you know, people can get a, you know, some kind of idea about what was happening with the politics of that time also.
Yes, well, what most people don't realize is that the slave trade itself had been abolished way before 1865. The first Slave Trade Act of the United States was actually in 1794.
Okay.
And let me put my glasses on again. And it was a law that was passed by the United States Congress that limited the United States involvement in the slave trade. It limited their involvement, but it didn't stop it. There were several amendments that were added to that, trying to strengthen the act, and they finally came out in 1807. It came out, as a matter of fact, on March 2nd of 1807, and it was a bill that was called, and I have to read it, an act to prohibit the importation of slaves into any part or place within the jurisdiction of the United States from and after the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1808. So, what this means is that what was to begin on January 1st of 1808 is that they were supposed to be outlawing the importation of slaves. Now, what we have to realize is that this was the importation, or bringing them to the shores of the United States. That was outlawed. One thing, though, that it did not outlaw, and that was slavery.
All right, and let's talk about that for a moment, because I think this is why I wanted to bring this up as a part of, slave ships, because it's important, and that's that despite the decrease and even though it was outlawed, it was outlawed that you could not bring slaves into the United States, that didn't mean that it still wasn't happening. We had pirates and other things. As a matter of fact, the United States was at war at times, and they would actually grab, if any ship that they would hold, they would enslave some of those captors. So the United States was actually enslaving and taking over ships during this time, which is another topic.
They could take over a ship, and again, because it was outlawed, then what they could do is they would find the ship, the ship owner. Okay. Right. They may find some of the people that were there on the ship, the crew. They may find them. I'm not sure, and then so they were making money off of that. Mm-hmm. But then they also took the slaves, so they still made money off of the slaves anyway. So
okay, yeah, and so that's crazy. So, but however, beyond that, you see a very large decrease in the number being, directly shipped here.
Yes, even though the numbers were small, like we said anyway, because only about maybe 300,000 during the entire slave trade were brought directly to the shores of the United States. But then we see that after 1800, that there was a very, very small number of slaves that were brought in. But what is interesting is that is the time that the slave numbers grew substantially.
Just went boom.
Yes.
Which is a whole nother point, and that's why we wanted to include that. It's not referencing the ships, but it is, because, the reality that they're bringing even less in than they have ever, although the number is very small to begin with, 300,000, but now, it's 1800, is outlawed for the most part, so now the numbers is not, instead of bringing in 50, 60,000, they're not even bringing that in anymore, but at the same time, the slave population internally just goes boom.
Yes.
And so further verify that, the slave, quote unquote, slave population in the United States, specifically in the southeastern portions.
Homegrown.
Right, homegrown, haha.
Homegrown.